education, but undertook regular forays into the less domesticated parts. They had to roll up whatever they were taking, and we presumed that they didn't roll up paper simply because it wouldn't have lasted. So for rolling up, rolling out, transporting, we feel fairly confident in saying that these were linens. There's a bit more that can be said about this, because if you go to page 14, there's a wonderful print of a Franciscan preacher in front of a congregation of Roman citizens. No, they're not actually Roman, they just look as though they're clothed as Romans. They're indigenous, draped in linen by the looks of it. But the point is, the preacher is drawing attention to, it's hard to say, the stages of the cross maybe, a whole series of paintings. And the text says these are linens. And they were a major instructional aid. The Indians liked to listen to the sermon, and then afterwards they would crowd around the pillar and reinforce the lesson by studying at closer quarters the various pictures. But it's interesting that linen is mentioned in the text. It's not any sort of support. It's linen. And then lastly, and I won't go any further with this, there's the most extraordinary story of Our Lady of Guadalupe, who in one final incarnation of the legend or the miracle has the Virgin appearing to this Indian and imprinting herself on his cover, what are they called? Cape, sort of cape. And here, the way this came to be depicted by artists, on the right here, and I'm sorry it's so bad, but this is God the Father actually painting the Virgin on, and from the way it's hanging, it has to be linen, it can't be canvas. Canvas is too heavy, too stiff. And the miracle was said to lie in the fact at this point that you can't paint on unstretched linen. Everybody knows that, unless you're God. So this is doubly miraculous, but for us it's so lovely that the linen has become an integral part of the miracle. So enough about linen, but just an illustration of the kind of crossing over which becomes inevitable and which I know you're all familiar with. But I think this program or workshop, whatever you're thinking of it as, and your mix of backgrounds fits in here perfectly, because one has to be fearless at a certain point, right? And read whatever literature seems apt and do whatever it takes to understand. And usually it's more than one object at this point, isn't it? For us it's linen and painting, but for you it's more complex things. But this is what we have to do. And we mustn't be timid about it and think that we don't have no expertise in these things. The point is that very few people do. So again, we just stride out boldly and do these things. And my rationale for being unqualified but yet speaking is that we're not pretending anything much. We're just saying, look at this. If you find it worthwhile, do improve upon it. And I think all our work has to be presented in this manner. Nothing is final. Nothing is the story. But others will come after us and do better. Well, I want to go back now to what I'm doing. Hans has a part in this, but not as big a part as in some of the things we do. I love numbers, and he's not so fascinated by numbers. So I play around with numbers. I mentioned earlier that we thought quite substantial numbers of linen paintings were made in metal. The way one can get a handle on this is to estimate productivity. Is that a word that says anything to you? It's a rate. It's the rate of output per unit of time or per person. So paintings per day, paintings per week, that's productivity. It's not the same as production, which you hear about all the time on the news, total production, GDP. That's an absolute, that's a total. This is a ratio or a rate. If you've got productivity, how many paintings an artist could produce in a day, in a week, in a year, just multiply by the number of artists that there were, and you've got potential total production for a year. I say potential because we don't know how many weeks in a year artists worked for. This becomes very important. 20 years ago, there was some striking publications by people now dead, so I don't want to malign them in any way. They were real pioneers. They made extraordinarily strong assumptions in order to get at what seemed like a reasonable estimate of the total number of paintings produced during the so-called golden age of the Dutch. The Dutch used to think of this as their century, the 17th century. It turns out that the golden age is only a few decades, actually, but it's 1580 more or less to 1670. After that, things went bad. But these early estimates were that 5 to 6 million paintings might have been made in those few decades, so 8 decades. 5 to 6 million. We don't have them, and that's because a lot have been lost, obviously, and the assumptions necessary to allow for depreciation and loss, to work from little things we know to whole countries and so on, of course they're very bold. And most recently, a man has written a master's thesis in Amsterdam in which he adds a couple of things that have more recently come to light to revise these numbers downwards. I'll give you the downward revision in a moment, but it's pretty striking. The major thing he's found is a new source with biographical information on a lot of artists in the North and South Netherlands, so the Dutch Republic, the Southern Netherlands under Spanish control. This biographical information on individual artists has them doing all kinds of things other than painting. So they painted and they had an inn, they painted and they engraved, they painted and they painted boats, they painted and they did the illustrations for books, they painted and they made frames. Often, as I'm saying that, often these are things not unrelated to painting. I mean, they're part of the arts, but they're a separate craft. And what this new estimator has done is say, look, if artists were not working at painting the whole year, but doing any one of a number of other things, we have to believe that they were not capable of making this many paintings. What we don't know is how many weeks in the year they did work at painting. And I'm going to make some, what I think are rather conservative assumptions in a moment to give a guess as to that. He didn't do much directly, but he said, look, I'll take some later people, 18th century, 19th century painters, well known, see how much they produced in a lifetime. These are people who've been studied intensively by art historians. We have Catalogue and Raisonné and so on. We're reasonably sure we have a good ballpark figure for how much they made in a lifetime. It was a fairly low number, and it adds up to about 26 paintings a year. 26 paintings a year. The new estimate, using this information, and assuming that the average painter didn't paint more than 26 paintings a year, and lots painted less, probably, has this down to 1 million. That's a revision, isn't it? So unfortunately the dead can't speak. They can grumble a bit, but they can't speak. But I think this result, or something like it, something close to it, will stand further scrutiny. And what I find intriguing is that it opens up one's mind to rethinking what was going on in these two competing cities, Antwerp on the one hand and Amsterdam on the other. The received history is that after 1585, when the Spanish took back Antwerp from a Calvinist government, brought in Counter-Reformation practices. I don't know if there was an Inquisition, but it was pretty strict control. Lots and lots of Protestants left, including artists and so on. The population of the city was halved in 5 years. Antwerp did recover somewhat, we know, partly due to a renewed church spending, refurbishment, new churches, and so on. But the received view is that Amsterdam fully took over. It became the world's entrepot rather than Antwerp. And it became the world's centre of paintings production rather than Antwerp. The two seem to go naturally together. For some time, we, not only we, others too, have had this suspicion that no, we think there were still pretty large numbers of painters active in Antwerp. So if that's the case, maybe it wasn't such a secondary production centre. What we think we have, and these now are actual counts, that's the other thing which is new. There are new sources available, not just of biographical information, the one I mentioned to you, but sources which give us actual counts of artists. They don't tell us whether these artists were active at any point in time. They just say this person designated him or herself as painter. We find more than 200 in Antwerp in 1616 and again in 1651, 52. Now 1616 is a few decades after the Catholic takeover of the city in 1585, and by about 1595 the church was spending a lot of money on new churches, new statuary, some new paintings. So the artist population, which fell to half in the 80s with the general population, could have recovered considerably. And the latest count finds over 200 names of people who call themselves artists. I have done a count for 1651-52, and I find also about the same number, different sources actually, but over 200. It's amazing because this is a period of recovery. It's understandable that there might have been a lot. This comes just 3 or 4 years after the Treaty of Westphalia, which settled the 30 Years' War, and it also settled the ongoing conflict of 100 years between the Dutch and the Spanish. So at that point, Antwerp faced open competition. There was no protection available to its producers of anything, including paintings. So we think its economic fortunes dipped after 1648 and probably would have led one to think that there should be fewer artists. There weren't. Then if we actually get to some numbers, what we need is productivity and total numbers of artists and number of weeks worked per year. We feel fairly confident that we can say that there were around 200. I've done a later count too, and it seems still in that range. Productivity is paintings per week. So if you've got paintings per artist per week, and the number of artists, you've got the total number of paintings, if you know how many weeks they worked. So 3 bits of information. The early estimates for Amsterdam, the Dutch Republic, the ones which produced this 5 to 6 million total of paintings, one assumed 52 weeks in the working year, and one assumed 50. Antwerp was a Catholic bulwark, as I said. Think about that. You have Sundays, which must be free. You have lots of saints' days, lots of important festivities in the church calendar, including Christmas and Easter, but others too. The best I can come to from studying various documents on church calendars is that maybe 260 days was the maximum year. So maybe they could work a lot longer in Protestant Holland, but they couldn't in Antwerp. This is about, is it 37 and a half, about 37 weeks, I think it was. I've said, okay, let's be fair about this, 25, let's assume 25. This is not too much, 25 weeks. So we've got what we think are viable numbers. I'm going to show you in a minute output per week, also from documents. And then I think this is a cautious assumption. Somewhat less than half the year when they work on paintings. So let me flip over this second one. Oops. Why is that not responding? Well, I'll escape and try it this way. Why is it?
At the bottom.
I just want that one. How did you get that? But I was hitting the wrong arrows.
These are the lateral ones.
Splendid. That's the one. We have dealers' records for the southern Netherlands. We don't have them for Antwerp, nor do we have guild records, which is why the early estimates for production in the Dutch Republic had to be based on a lot of assumptions. We have dealers' records which don't tell us that precisely, but more or less what particular artists produced of various sorts in particular spans of time. So these are just 3 examples. Jan Bruegel II worked alone. He had assistants, but he's not in any category with others. There's a group of painters, not just this Van Neck person, but others. And then there's a group, this Van Staalbent and others. And my best guess, it's not really a guess, it's a guesstimate, based on a few fuzzy at the edge kind of assumptions, is Bruegel was capable of producing almost 0.7 of a painting per week. So was this Van Neck and others, but they were lesser painters and they were paid a bit less. So they're in a different category. And von Stalbemt and co. were a bit faster. Probably did a lot of copying work. In fact, I know they did a lot of copying. So output per year, if you assume 25 weeks, is that. These are close to the numbers which this latest revision for the North has. 26 paintings a year on average. Much more here. Again, small works, lots of small paintings came out of Antwerp, and copies. These are for oils, but we also have one or two documents which give us a productivity rate for these water-based paintings, and in this case it's the same Jan Bruegel, and it's much higher, as you would expect. This, remember the mixture, it's white of egg mixed with rabbit's foot glue. You're comparing that with oil. Which dries faster? The rabbit's foot. Glue. It dries very fast compared with oil. You're not having to wait between layers for painfully long periods and then having to layer carefully one brushing on top of the other. These could be done pretty quickly. So for when we translate this back into output in Mechelen, we get numbers like it could have been somewhere between 7,000 and 5,000 a year. Per year, and Antwerp. So these things are always visible for about 2 lines.
You want that? How that one, is it working or not?
Well, I haven't used it for a while. Yes, it's right. I won't write much of it. For Antwerp, I calculate $5.5. Remember, we're talking oils, so it's a little bit lower. And this is based on a rough, as this has to be refined, what economists know as a weighted average. So you have to find people who worked at different rates and say, but how important were they in the whole? So 0.3 times something plus 0.4 times something, and add those up. We get this. Demand, we know from a recent study of inventories in Antwerp, so we know holdings of paintings per house, 1630 and 1680. And there's an increase, which we have to adjust for depreciated paintings which have to be replaced. And so the new paintings necessary to get to the second figure is what is of interest. And that gives us an annual demand of about 3,000, the local demand. So at the very least there would have been almost as many again as a surplus supply. Surplus over and above local demand. But these two, Antwerp and Mechelen, were a single complex. These people produced watercolor paintings, these people produced oils, these were cheap, these were not. So they covered the whole market. So it's not 5.5, it's 5.5 plus another 5 or so. So 10,000 paintings surplus, which is where Hans and I come in again and say, oh, we do have a problem here. We have to discover to whom, when, where, how the surplus was disposed of, and that's our contribution to the deal.
Can I just clarify something? So you're not supposing that the Mechelen paintings are all watermelon?
No, but they were pretty well, or when they wanted good oil paintings for churches, they imported them from Antwerp. So yes, there are some which are not. Take off 500. No problem.